Good morning, and welcome to this live online session regarding recognizing and reporting child abuse and the new requirements for Pennsylvania. My name is Ashley Graves with the Center for Schools and Communities, and I will be today's moderator. This online session is possible due to the generosity of the Pennsylvania Department of Health and is part of the Center for Schools and Communities Safe Kids Pennsylvania Initiative Professional Development Series. Today, our presenter is Leah Galkowski. Leah is a Safe Schools Coordinator at the Center for Schools and Communities and has worked at the center since 1999. Leah is a graduate of the Penn State University with a bachelor's degree in Administration of Justice and a minor in Spanish. She attended the training of trainers for recognizing and reporting child abuse training for mandated reporters. At the center, Leah is also a certified Old bullying prevention trainer and supports the Mission Homefront initiative. For housekeeping purposes, the audience for today's presentation includes professionals from various backgrounds who are interested in learning more about new requirements regarding recognizing and reporting child abuse in Pennsylvania. This webinar will be recorded and made available for everyone by email notice and through the Safe Kids webpage after the session is concluded. I will now turn the mic over to Leah Galkowski, our presenter.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's session, Recognizing and Reporting of Child Abuse, the New Requirements for Pennsylvania. Our objectives for today are to talk about a brief overview of the reporting requirements. We'll go over at length, but not too much length, the changes to the Pennsylvania legislation, and of course where you can go to get the training as required by your positions. If you have questions along the way, we'll try to answer those as you have them. In addition, we have a couple of interactive polling questions that will help you participate with us. Not too long ago, I was reading an article about effective presentations, and one of the recommendations in making an effective presentation was to tell a story. Well, when we're talking about child abuse and we're talking about legislative updates, it's hard to tell a story, but I decided to talk about this one, and this story begins with a child called It. From an early age, this child was punished, beaten, abused, and nearly killed by his alcoholic mother. She beat him severely, burned him, starved him, stabbed him, isolated him, and tried on multiple occasions to kill him. On March 5th, 1973, It's math teacher, the school nurse, and the school principal invited him to talk to a police officer about his mother and the things that had been happening at home. It was removed from his home that day. He was 12 years old and weighed 68 pounds. He had a new bruise above his eye. He had a scar on his chest from where his mother had tried to stab him. He had a scar on his arm where she had burned him on the top of the stove. And his throat was raw from her holding his head over a bucket filled with cleaning chemicals and forcing him to breathe it in. The police officer informed his mother that he would not be coming home and drove that little boy out of the city and told him that he was free. That boy called It by his mother grew up to become Dave Pelzer. His story is an inspirational story of resilience, overcoming unspeakable cruelty, and the courage of those individuals at Thomas Edison Elementary School in San Diego, California, to speak up and do something. That something saved his life. In 1973, we didn't have the laws and regulations that we now have regarding the mandated reporting of child abuse. Why focusing on 1975? Well, the reason I'm talking about 1975 is that that is the year the Child Protective Services law was first passed, in November of that year. It came about as part of a national effort to increase the reporting of child abuse, of suspected child abuse. So if we think back to March 5th, 1973, when little David Pelzer and his teachers talked to the police officer at Thomas Edison Elementary School, there really wasn't any mandated reporter of suspected child abuse law. So if we think about that, we really have to understand that this group of teachers and staff at that elementary school stepped outside the box and did something that wasn't mandated. They weren't required to do that, but they took a look at what was happening and how it was impacting Dave Pelzer and decided to do something about it. So, of course, what happens when we pass legislation is that then there are a slew of adjustments, amendments, clarifications, and they come in pretty much rapid succession. In 1982, Act 136 amended the perpetrator definition to include persons living in the same household. In 1985 was the first time that we required criminal history checks for people who worked in child care services, and asked or required them to also go under a child line screening, which a child line is our child abuse history reporting and child line check system in Pennsylvania. In 1994, there were some major revisions put into place and implemented over a 3-year period of time, and they did include imminent risk and student abuse were added at that time. And there were further clarifications added into the definition of child abuse. In 2002, the Volunteers for Children Act, and this was actually implemented in 2003, kind of what we're experiencing right now, but we'll talk more about that. It strengthened the law by permitting FBI or federal background checks for Pennsylvania residents who apply for employment in child care services or to adopt children. So adoptive parents also had to complete the FBI check in 2003, and that was not required before that period of time. So this is just a snapshot of some of the changes that have happened since 1975. But in 2014, there were significant sweeping changes to the law, and we'll talk about some of those changes today. One of the significant changes is the definition of child abuse and perpetrator were expanded. Some clarifications were added. Another change was the reporting process has changed. And I will go through each one of these with a little bit more detail so we don't have to focus on this slide at this point. There was an expansion of who is a mandated reporter. There was significant changes in 2014 requiring training for all mandated reporters and how much training. We'll go over that in pretty much detail toward the end of the presentation. The protections for mandated reporters were expanded, and the liability for a failure to report was also increased. There were also significant changes in the requirements for child abuse and criminal history clearances. A lot of definition put into who is required to have clearances, a lot of clarification around who is required to have clearances and what those clearances entail. So let's talk briefly about 2014. What do you believe was the #1? Now this is only last year, so hopefully all of you were around last year and maybe listened to the radio once in a while and might know what the #1 single was in 2014. Michael will put up another polling question with radio buttons for us here in a couple seconds. Was it All About That Bass by Meghan Trainor? Was it Shake It Off by Taylor Swift? Was it Happy by Pharrell Williams? Or All of Me by John Legend? Pardon me, John Legend. Go ahead and click one of those radio buttons and tell me what you think the #1 chart topping single was in 2014. I'm sorry I don't have the music put on the background. Well, maybe we'll do that for the next presentation because I certainly can't sing for you. So 57% of us believe that it was Happy by Pharrell Williams, with a pretty far behind Shake It Off by Taylor Swift. So if we go ahead and switch back to the slide set. And the answer is, drum roll please, Happy by Pharrell Williams. You were all correct. Okay, one more polling question. We'll go back to the gasoline prices in 2014. What did we pay for a gallon of gas in 2014? Was it 55 cents a gallon? Was it $2.68 a gallon? Was it $3.28 a gallon? Or was it $3.68 a gallon? What is your belief? Go ahead and click on the radio buttons and let us know what you believe the price for a gallon of gasoline was last year in 2014. Okay, let's see where we are. We believe in today's webinar that it was $3, or no, 54% of us believe that it was $3.68 a gallon last year. So let's go ahead and switch over back to the slide set. And the answer is $3.68 a gallon. You guys are pretty good. You know your 2014 history. I also, if you want to take a look at that gas pump, how different it was from the gas pump that we had in 1975. A lot more complicated. But I'm also very happy that we are not paying $3.68 a gallon right now. Usually our prices go up from year to year, but we are grateful that they went down this year. So I focused on 2014 because that is when the major legislative changes happened, and they are all the majority of them are implemented as of January 1st of 2015. So one of the significant changes was the categories of child abuse have changed. They've expanded. Some of them have opened up the threshold of what meets the criteria for child abuse or what meets the definition. If any of you have had the training in the last 2 years, you might notice that the definitions of child abuse in Pennsylvania were pretty restrictive about what might meet those definitions. These changes that happened in 2014 really expanded some of those definitions and lowered the threshold to open up those definitions and what might meet child abuse in Pennsylvania. The column on the left shows the categories of child abuse in Pennsylvania's Child Protective Services law prior to 2015, and the column on the right shows you the new categories. So you can see that we've added a couple of things, we've clarified some things, and when you go for your 2 or 3 hour requirement, they will go into these definitions in a lot of detail, but I think what it's important for you to know as a mandated reporter, you're not required to meet this definition or to understand that this type of injury meets that definition. The only thing that you're required to do is if you suspect child abuse and you are a mandated reporter, you are required to make a report. So while we'll talk about what these definitions, some of these definitions are and some of these clarifications are, I think it's important for you as a mandated reporter to understand that you're not required to conduct that investigation and to meet that definition. You can see that imminent risk was eliminated, and what was put in its place is the likelihood of serious bodily injury or the likelihood of sexual abuse. The other thing that was added is the per se definitions, and to me that's kind of just a catch-all category. Those other things that didn't quite fit under some of the other categories of abuse now kind of fit under that per se definition. The other significant change in Pennsylvania, and this is, I would say, a huge shift in legislative trends for Pennsylvania, is the expansion of perpetrator. And what has happened here is that whole category of student abuse that was in the prior Child Protective Services law in Pennsylvania is gone, and school employees are now considered under the alleged perpetrator definition if there is an incident of suspected child abuse. So the clarification here is that the perpetrator maintains parents of any age. It does include a spouse, a paramour, a former spouse, or a former paramour of the child's parent. So that person doesn't necessarily have to be in a caretaker role or living in the home. They just have to be in one of those categories: a spouse, paramour, or former paramour of the child's parent. This also specifies a person who is responsible for the welfare of the child must be over the age of 14. So in a babysitter capacity, the child must be over the age of 14 to be considered a perpetrator of child abuse if suspected child abuse has occurred. The other thing that this specifies is that the person responsible includes any person who has direct or regular contact with a child through any program, activity, or service sponsored by a school, for-profit, or religious or other not-for-profit organization. School employees and independent contractors are added to the persons responsible for a child's welfare. This really is the big expansion and eliminates that student abuse category. And this legislative change maintains that an individual residing in the same household as the child must be 14 years of age or older to be considered a perpetrator of abuse. Relatives that are 18 years of age or older and related within the third degree of blood, marriage, or adoption to the child. So this includes all of those blood relatives who may be at a picnic or a family gathering, or and not necessarily in a caretaker role, who might be considered as an alleged perpetrator if suspected abuse has occurred. Like I said, this is a very quick overview of these changes, and when you complete your 2 or 3 hours, which is whatever is required by your position, you will get a much more expanded definition of what those categories of perpetrator are. So the other thing that has changed in this year in 2015, legislated in 2014, but implemented in 2015, is how to make a report. Prior to this year, it was often that in schools or in programs that the person who received the report or the information regarding suspected abuse would go up the chain of command in their organization, and then the director, or often in schools a guidance counselor or principal, would make those reports directly to Childline. That's not what is to happen under the new legislation. The new legislation requires that the person who received the information regarding the suspected abuse is the person who is required to make the report. So if you're a teacher in a program or a volunteer in an after-school program, I believe some of you are paramedics or emergency medical service providers. If you receive information from the child or suspect abuse when you see a child, then you are the person who is required to make that report, not your supervisor or not anyone else in your chain of command. So some clarifications around the making of the report is we also now have an option for electronic reporting. It's important for mandated reporters to understand that contact with children as a part of your work or through the regularly scheduled program or activity or service is what makes you a mandated reporter. And is the person who is responsible for the child or works for an agency that is directly responsible for that child, and someone makes a specific disclosure to you, then you are then the mandated reporter in that situation and must report directly to Childline. In addition, a person who's 14 years or older makes a disclosure to you that they have committed child abuse. You are also a mandated reporter in that situation as well. And if you receive third-party information, so if you receive information from another person or another child and that is believable, you have enough information, you can identify the child who might be a victim of child abuse, then you are also a mandated reporter in that situation also, and you must make the report directly to Childline in that instance. You must also follow your verbal or electronic report with a written report. So the clarification is that if you make the electronic report, just print out a copy of the report that is made and you're good, because that is also the written report. So, and in addition, you can report directly to Childline, you can report directly to the Children and Youth Agency as well. So who are mandated reporters? There was a lot of information in the 2014 legislation clarifying who mandated reporters are. And that has been expanded to include colleges and universities into the definition of school. In the previous legislation, it just identified that school employees are mandated reporter. This legislation clarified that school also means a college and a university, including local education agencies. It also adds those who provide a program, activity, or service sponsored by a school to the definition of school employee. In addition, it adds to the definition of mandated reporter a licensed or certified in a health-related field, an individual paid or unpaid who accepts responsibility for a child in a program, activity, or service. This change clearly includes volunteers as mandated reporters, whereas in the previous Child Protective Services law, they were not included. This legislation clearly outlines that emergency medical service providers are also mandated reporters, public library employees who have direct contact with children, and independent contractors of schools, which is a huge expansion into the definition of mandated reporter. So I talked a little bit earlier about the requirement for training of mandated reporters. So a lot of it, I think the clarification here is a lot of it is related to your licensure. So depending on when you receive your license and when you're up for license renewal is when you need to get your required amount of training. So, and some definitions here. DOS is Department of State, and DHS here on my slide is the Department of Human Services. Licensed or certified professionals who are mandated reporters and the renewal or license or certification, that's how your requirement for training is based upon that. So school staff and independent contractors must have at least 3 hours. And professional license, if you maintain or hold a professional license from the Department of State, you are required to have at least 2 hours. Agencies and sub-agencies under the Department of Human Services are required to have 3 hours, and new foster parents are also required to have 3 hours of mandated reporter training. It's important to understand that the curriculum must be approved by the Department of Human Services. There are very few organizations out there who currently have a curriculum approved, and at the end of today's presentation I'll talk to you about one of those organizations where you can go to get your required training. And the curriculum must include the reporting policy, and it's also important to understand that within 6 months of the effective date of the 3 hours of training and the issuance of your licensure is based on your ability to show that everybody in your organization has the required amount of training. So those of you working in organizations, you need to make sure that you keep records of who received what training, how many hours of training they have, and maintain a tracking record for that as well. New employees and new foster parents shall also receive 3 hours of training within 90 days of hire or approval as a foster parent. And then they need to receive 3 hours of training every 5 years after that. So that's a lot of information, and I'm going over it rather quickly. So if you do have questions about that, we can talk about that at the end of the presentation. I don't see any right now. But if you do, or if I don't cover it in today's presentation, you have my contact information also at the end of today's presentation. So you can send me an email and I can clarify any of that for you. One of the other things that was expanded in the 2014 amendments was the immunity from liability for GPS reports. This is basically a clarification that it includes making a GPS report in the protections for mandated reporter. It expands this immunity for reporting, cooperating, and consulting in investigations testifying in proceedings as a result of the report, taking photographs, arranging for medical tests and x-rays, and taking a child in protective custody, admitting a child to a private or public hospital to include general protective services cases as well. So it's really just a clarification that not only Child Protective Services allegations or concerns were immune from liability, but also general protective service reports are also immune from liability. There was a significant increase in the penalties for failure to report. So if someone who has knowingly seen or heard about child abuse and it is indicated or founded and is determined to be a first-degree felony or higher, then the willful failure to report this crime is also a first-degree felony charge. So there are significant increases in not reporting, penalties associated with not reporting. Another one of the significant changes, and I keep saying that, but just to point out the number of changes, the Child Protective Services law in Pennsylvania was 4 pages prior to 2014. The Child Protective Services law, as I printed it out 3 months ago, is now 14 pages. So you can see there was a lot of clarification, a lot of expansion of definitions placed into the law, a lot more information. So it's important to see that all of these people are now required to have all of their clearances, and that means child abuse checks, state police criminal history checks, and the federal FBI fingerprint required check also. These clearances are required for these people for every 36 months, and the last of these changes will go into effect starting July 1st, as you can see in the last bullet there. So one of the things that it's important to point out is they're sending us some clarifications about whether or not originals are required for every position that you have. So if you, for example, I work as an employee of the Central Susquehanna Intermediate Unit under the Center for Schools and Communities, so I am required to get all 3 of my clearances as an employee of this organization. In my other life as a parent, I am a volunteer in my kids' school district. So as a volunteer and a chaperone on their field trips, at school functions, I am also required to have my clearances. Do I need originals for both of those organizations? And if I do, just to point that out, that's $47 for one organization and another $47 for another. So the Department of Education and the Department of Human Services understands this as a challenge for a lot of people, so they're working on providing clarification for us around that. The last clarification that will go into effect for volunteers beginning July 1st, 2014, they're not required to have the third and the fingerprint FBI check if the position, if it meets all 3 of these bullet points here. So if they are a volunteer, they're not paid for this work that they do with kids, their position is unpaid, they have been a Pennsylvania resident for 10 years or more, and they sign an affidavit swearing or affirming that they have not been convicted of a crime under this section of the Child Protective Services law. Basically, they say that they haven't committed any child abuse crimes or related child abuse crimes, and then they're not required as a volunteer to have that FBI check. So the questions that I have for you after going over all of these changes are, do you currently have a policy in place for obtaining your training for yourself or employees of your organization, and what is your procedure for getting that training? Do you have any questions around how to to come up with a policy for that training. In addition, since I believe we're all on here for the same reason, because we work around for or with children, what is your policy and procedure for obtaining your clearances for yourself or your employees? Do you have those policies in place? If you can put some of that information in the text box, if you have some policies in place or have some procedures in place for obtaining your clearances and obtaining your training. If you have any questions about that at this time, you can go ahead and put that in there in the text box. Oh, I can't see the question. Okay, no. The first one we have is that no policy is currently in place. We were just advised to seek clearances by a determined date in order to continue working. I think that's where a lot of people are right now, is to, okay, while in the process, while we're getting a policy together or something more organized, everybody has to know off the, right away, you need all the clearances and you need to get that done. And here's my advice to you about that is, if you need them, get them done right away, or start the process right away, because there are some significant backlogs at this time. So you need to do that. The other advice I have for you is to do it online for your child abuse background check. In Pennsylvania, that is the fastest way to do it, or go right to the Childline offices on the state hospital grounds here in Harrisburg, if you have the ability to do that, if you're close. Those are the fastest way to get your child abuse clearances done at this time. If you print out and mail in and do the hard copy, that's a minimum of 4 to 6 weeks to get that back to you at this time, or at least that was the information a week or so ago that we were getting. Okay, the other question I have here is that we have a background company that conducts our checks for us. They do have a national crime check, not FBI. They have PSP check, Childline check, and driver's record check. How often do we need to recheck these? The requirement is that they need to have a recheck every 36 months. That they need to have the recheck. So once you have it, keep track of when you got it, and then they need to have it again in 36 months. The other thing I think it's important to point out is that if you change positions, if you move from one position to another, you're required to get new clearances. So your clearances that, like if I worked for School District A in January through June, and then starting in August I worked for School District B, I'm required to get new clearances for School District B. So I think that's important to know, that as long as you're with the same organization, your clearances are good for 36 months, and then you need to get new ones, or if your organization is doing them, they need to get new ones. But if you change positions, then you need to have new clearances. Okay, I think that's all for our questions. Like I said, you'll have my contact information at the end of today's presentation.